Hello, Tom Barnett here again with another story behind the illustration. This one trying to capture a rather important but somewhat complex to explain development in warfare over the decades, namely the downsizing of conflict across the Cold War and post-Cold War periods. As you can see in this final version of the illustration, we ended up throwing pretty much everything at this one, including the kitchen sink. But let's go back to where this whole effort began. Here is the slide I have used for many years to explain what I have dubbed the downshifting of conflict over the decades, employing Kenneth Waltz's three images of world system, nation states, and then finally individuals. In other words, leaders, human beings in general, societies within nations. I've used this approach to differentiate between scopes of conflict. So world wars on top, classic state-on-state wars in the middle, and subnational conflict, often labeled civil strife, at the bottom. I won't go into the details here, which I explain in the book, other than to highlight the punchline, or the often buried lead in most accounts of conflict today, being the reality that the vast majority of violence within the system as a whole unfolds subnationally, within nations, not between them, and not typically directly involving nuclear great powers whatsoever. So no, this observation doesn't mean nuclear war is ruled out for all time and under all conditions, nor does it say that superpowers still can't engage in attempted regime changes like the U.S. in Afghanistan, like the U.S. in Iraq, like the U.S. in Libya, like the U.S. in Syria. You get the picture. Or like Russia in Ukraine today, or Israel in Gaza. Also instances where great powers, nuclear powers, seek regime change. But even in those two instances, look at how the conflicts seem semi-subnational in nature. Russia intervening to support breakaway regions in Ukraine, however manufactured. Israel dealing with an insurgency, Hamas, effectively inside its recognized borders. Anyway, this slide is saying obviously a ton of things at once and making a very big point. Thus, we felt the need for the image to be likewise crowded and full of visual cues about all of this. Here again, we started with some Sarah Nuttall conceptual drawings. First, toying with some World War I imagery, oddly predictive of how Russia versus Ukraine has stalled out as a conflict. Then exploring the notion of all that conflict being distilled down to something else. A very cool image here, but one that's just too wide open to interpretation. Then there was this layered look that Sarah came up with, and what attracted me here was that she was attempting to get three levels visually distinct from one another. So nukes on top at that system level, then conventional platforms, and that kind of state-on-state classic conflict in the middle, and then at the bottom, mano-a-mano, subnational conflict. I really like the ambition here. It's just that the images were not meshing like they should, but she got us to the general approach, which was invaluable. And that general layout was what Jim Nuttall then took and turned into this magnificent illustration that is a clear favorite of mine. So like Sarah's original conceptualization, you have the mano-a-mano fight at the center of the image, suggesting, in my mind, Francis Fukuyama's Wars of the Spirit bit at the end of his famous book, The End of History and the Last Man. The notion being that the big questions of war, my system or yours, have largely ended, and we are now on a global trajectory in which most of the conflicts are over identity, spirit. Not how to organize government, but how people are treated on an individual basis, their self-actualization, and so on. I think that concept, wars of the spirit, is still very valid, and thus Fukuyama's book still works, in my mind, despite all the criticism both he and the book have suffered since. So, by the time we had submitted the first complete manuscript to Ben Bella in the late summer of 2022, we had our fundamental approach figured out here. Wars of identity at the center, sort of a who's your daddy world, but diligently followed by the larger models of war, all of which are ready to jump in as needed, even as they remain peripheral to the real contest at the core. Basically, who am I in this complex world and where do I belong? Those larger models of war are all neatly presented here and ordered correctly. So classic infantry on the bottom for subnational warfare, platforms galore for state-on-state war, and then nuclear missiles on top. Everything poised and ready to go, but largely in service of these far more individualized, even intimate, if you will, culture wars at the core, because that's where the real tension in the system is presently being concentrated. There was just one last fix to this illustration, and it came during a late in the book creation process effort that we undertook to take advantage of all the artistic talent at Throughline. Namely, we had two graphic art experts, Myrta Dodens and Andy Martin, go over all of our final draft illustrations, looking for mistakes and or suggesting additions and fixes. On this one, we got a great input from the two. Here you have this circle image at the bottom center, suggesting a wrestling mat in a ring. By tradition, that's usually a largely blank space, but oftentimes you'll see a school logo. So their advice was, why not add something there, fill in that space. Their idea for that space was great, a world globe. And so we ran with it in the final book version you see here. In the end, I really like this illustration because to me it is very Dr. Seuss-like in its sort of ridiculous ramping up of force on both sides when the fight really comes down to this very singular struggle in the middle between the two combatants. So that's the story behind this illustration. Again, a particular favorite of mine because it's one of the most Seussian of the lot. And yeah, I realize I'm showing my age there. As always, we love it when people buy the book, when they recommend the book, when they praise the book online. I and my Throughline colleagues, we feel very passionate about this work. Please consider subscribing to my Substack newsletter. And see you next time, next illustration.